There are moments in maritime history that shatter everything we think we know about the ocean. Moments that defy physics, logic, and every instinct honed over centuries of seafaring. What happened to Captain Daniel Ashford on the morning of July 12, 2019, is one of those moments. A veteran sailor with 32 years of experience vanished from his 42-foot sloop in conditions so calm that the sea looked like polished glass. No distress call, no struggle, no body. Just a voice recorder left running on the deck, capturing his final words. Words so bizarre that the Coast Guard investigators who first heard them requested psychiatric evaluation before filing their report. This isn't a story about a rogue wave or a sudden storm. This is a story about something far stranger, something that challenges our fundamental understanding of what can happen on the open water. In this video, we're going to dissect every second of Daniel's final hour, analyze the audio recording that has baffled maritime experts worldwide, and reveal the chilling explanation that emerged from months of investigation. Because what took Daniel Ashford wasn't the sea at all. It was something he brought with him, something invisible, something that turned a perfect sailing day into a nightmare that haunts every sailor who learns his story. This is a lesson about the most dangerous thing you can bring aboard a boat, more dangerous than a faulty radio or a torn sail. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why even the most experienced among us are never truly safe from this silent threat. Daniel Ashford wasn't a weekend warrior or a dreamer with more ambition than skill. At 57 years old, he was a man who had earned his reputation the hard way, through decades of challenging passages and weather that would send most sailors running for harbor. He'd been a commercial fisherman in his 20s, working the brutal waters off Alaska's coast, where a single mistake meant hypothermia and death. He'd crossed the Atlantic 6 times, the Pacific twice, and had sailed solo from San Diego to the Marquesas when he was 43, a passage that tested every ounce of his seamanship. His friends described him as methodical to the point of obsession, the kind of man who checked his rigging 3 times before leaving the dock, who kept maintenance logs so detailed they read like technical manuals. Daniel had salt water in his veins, they said, and a respect for the ocean that bordered on reverence. He understood that the sea didn't care about your experience or your confidence. It was an environment of absolute indifference, and survival meant constant vigilance. His boat, the Meridian's Call, was a Tiana 42, a blue water cruiser known for its bulletproof construction and seaworthiness. Daniel had purchased her in 2011 and spent 2 full years refitting her to his exacting standards. He replaced the standing rigging entirely, upgraded the electrical system, installed a state-of-the-art navigation suite with redundant GPS units, and reinforced the hull-to-deck joint. The boat had new sails, new ground tackle, and enough safety equipment to outfit a small fleet. Daniel had a 406 MHz Perb, a satellite phone, 3 VHF radios, a life raft that was serviced annually, and a ditch bag packed with emergency supplies that he updated every 6 months. He wasn't the kind of sailor who cut corners or relied on luck. Every system had a backup. Every backup had been tested, and every test had been logged in his meticulous records. But Daniel's preparation went beyond equipment. He was a student of the sea in the truest sense. His cabin was lined with books on meteorology, oceanography, and navigation. He subscribed to pilot charts, studied current patterns, and could read weatherfax charts like some people read morning newspapers. He'd taken courses in celestial navigation, marine diesel repair, and emergency medicine. He practiced man-overboard drills alone, timing himself as he deployed his life sling and ran through the recovery procedures. He knew that solo sailing meant you were your own rescue team, and he trained accordingly. His friends joked that Daniel prepared for sailing trips the way astronauts prepared for space missions, but they all admitted they'd trust him in conditions where they wouldn't trust themselves. The voyage that would become his last was supposed to be a simple one, almost routine by Daniel's standards. He was sailing from Santa Barbara to San Diego, a coastal passage of about 140 nautical miles that he'd completed at least 20 times before. It was early July, the heart of summer, when the California coast enjoys some of its most stable weather. The marine forecast called for light winds from the northwest, 5 to 10 knots, with seas of 2 to 3 feet. Visibility was unlimited, and no weather systems were anywhere near the Southern California bight. It was the kind of forecast that makes sailors smile, perfect conditions for an easy passage under sunny skies. Daniel left Santa Barbara at dawn on July 11th, planning to make a leisurely overnight trip and arrive in San Diego the following afternoon. He'd made this passage so many times he could practically do it blindfolded, but he filed a float plan with the harbor master anyway, noting his departure time, planned route, and expected arrival. It was exactly the kind of attention to detail that defined his sailing career. The first 24 hours were textbook perfect. Daniel's AIS transponder showed Meridian's call, making steady progress down the coast, maintaining an average speed of about 5 knots under a comfortable sail plan of reefed mainsail and working jib. He checked in with a fellow sailor via VHF around sunset on July 11th, reporting that he was off Point Conception and that conditions were ideal. His voice on that transmission was relaxed and cheerful. He mentioned that he'd seen dolphins earlier in the afternoon and that he was enjoying a spectacular sunset. He planned to continue through the night on a series of 3-hour watches, a routine he'd perfected over years of solo sailing. Everything about that conversation suggested a man completely at ease, in his element, doing what he loved most in conditions that couldn't have been better. But at 6:47 a.m. on July 12th, something changed. A fishing vessel named the Pacific Dawn, working about 8 miles southwest of Santa Barbara Island, noticed a yacht drifting with no one visible on deck. The boat was Meridian's call. Through binoculars, the crew of the Pacific Dawn could see that her sails were up but luffing, flapping uselessly in the light wind. The boat was making no headway, just wallowing gently in the calm seas. There was no one at the helm, no one in the cockpit, no movement of any kind. The fishing vessel altered course and approached, hailing on VHF Channel 16. No response. They closed to within 50 yards and hailed again, this time using a loudhailer. Still nothing. The captain of the Pacific Dawn, a veteran commercial fisherman named Roberto Martinez, felt his stomach tighten. He'd been on the water for 38 years, and he knew what an abandoned boat looked like. He called the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard dispatched a response boat from their Channel Island station, and they arrived on scene at 8:15 a.m. What they found was deeply unsettling. Meridian's call was floating in what maritime accident investigators later described as mirror calm conditions. The sea state was essentially flat, with only the gentlest of swells barely disturbing the water's surface. There was no wind to speak of, maybe 3 knots from the northwest. Visibility was unlimited under clear skies. These were conditions where you could balance a coin on the cabin top and it wouldn't fall over. The boat itself appeared completely normal. There was no damage to the hull, no broken rigging, no sign of collision or fire. The sails, though luffing, were properly set. The tiller was amidships and secured with a bungee cord, a typical setup for maintaining a course under autopilot or self-steering gear. The cockpit was tidy, with no loose gear or signs of a struggle. Everything looked exactly as it should, on a well-maintained cruising boat on a coastal passage. The Coast Guard crew boarded carefully, calling out as they stepped into the cockpit. No answer. They went below, moving through the boat with growing confusion. The cabin was neat and organized. Daniel's coffee mug sat on the navigation table, still half full, the coffee cold, but not yet showing signs of mold or decomposition. His laptop was open on the settee, displaying a weather routing program, with his course plotted from Santa Barbara to San Diego. His satellite phone was charging in its bracket. The stove was off, but there was a pan with the remnants of scrambled eggs in the sink, suggesting he'd eaten breakfast not long before. His foul weather gear hung on its hook. His safety harness and tether were coiled neatly in the cockpit locker. His life jacket was stowed in its designated spot. Everything was in its place, which made Daniel's absence all the more inexplicable. But it was what they found on deck that transformed this from a puzzling disappearance into something that would haunt investigators for months. Sitting on the cockpit seat, held in place by a small gear bag to prevent it from sliding, was Daniel's digital voice recorder. It was still running, its display showing that it had been recording for nearly 4 hours. The Coast Guard crew carefully stopped the recording, bagged the device as evidence, and transported it back to shore. When they played it back at the station, with a senior investigator and a psychologist present, what they heard made them look at each other with expressions that mixed confusion, disbelief, and something approaching fear. The recording captured Daniel's voice, clear and unmistakable, but what he was saying made no sense at all. Not because it was incoherent rambling, but because he was describing things that couldn't possibly be happening on a calm sea in perfect weather. The recording begins with mundane sounds that confirm the peaceful conditions. You can hear the gentle lapping of water against the hull, the soft creaking of the rigging, and the flap of the sails catching occasional puffs of wind. Daniel's voice comes in, and he sounds completely normal, even cheerful. He states the time, 5:15 a.m., and begins what appears to be a standard verbal log entry, a practice many solo sailors adopt to document their voyage and maintain a sense of routine. He describes his position, about 10 miles south of Santa Barbara Island, and notes that he's making good time. He comments on the beautiful dawn, the way the light is hitting the Channel Islands, and how smooth the passage has been. He mentions that he's looking forward to arriving in San Diego, that he plans to meet an old friend for dinner, and that he's thinking about sailing down to Ensenada next month. Everything in these first few minutes suggests a content sailor enjoying a perfect morning on the water. Then, about 8 minutes into the recording, there's a subtle shift in his tone. It's not dramatic at first, just a slight change in the quality of his voice, a hint of something that might be confusion or curiosity. He says, that's interesting. There's a pause, and you can hear him moving around the cockpit, his footsteps on the fiberglass deck. Then he says, the water's changing color. I've never seen that before, not like this. It's going from blue to kind of a gray-green, but there's a pattern to it, like cells or something, geometric shapes. That's really unusual. There's another pause, longer this time, and then he says something that sounds almost like he's trying to convince himself. Must be some kind of algae bloom, or maybe a temperature gradient making the light refract differently. Yeah, that's probably it. For the next several minutes, Daniel continues his verbal log, but his comments become increasingly focused on the water. He describes the color changes becoming more pronounced, spreading out from his position in what he calls expanding hexagons. He notes that the pattern seems to be moving, pulsing almost, like a slow-motion strobe light under the surface. His voice carries a tone of scientific curiosity mixed with mild concern. He wonders aloud whether he should alter course to avoid whatever phenomenon he's witnessing. But then he seems to dismiss the idea, saying the water is clearly calm and poses no obvious threat. He mentions that his depth sounder is still reading 800 feet, confirming he's well offshore in deep water, so it can't be a reef or shallow area causing the effect. Around the 20-minute mark, Daniel's voice changes again, and this time the shift is unmistakable. The calm, analytical tone gives way to something tighter, more uncertain. Okay, this is getting weird, he says. The pattern's coming up. I mean, it's rising. I can see structures under the water like towers or pillars, but they're not solid. They're made of the same stuff as the pattern, just denser. They're moving up toward the surface. There's a sound that might be Daniel standing up quickly, and his breathing becomes more audible on the recording. This doesn't make any sense. There's nothing on the charts here. Nothing. Just deep water and normal ocean floor topography. This shouldn't be here. What happens next is the part of the recording that investigators found most disturbing. Daniel begins to describe, in increasingly agitated detail, a structure emerging from the water ahead of his boat. He calls it a bridge at first, then corrects himself. saying it's more like a causeway or a road, perfectly straight and extending from the water's surface up into the air at a slight incline. He says it's made of the same geometric pattern he saw in the water, but now it's solid, or solid-looking, translucent, but definitely there. He insists he can see it clearly, that it's maybe 200 yards ahead of his position, stretching from the ocean up toward the sky. His voice rises as he says, "This is impossible. I'm looking right at it. It's there. I can see it, but it can't be there." The next few minutes of the recording are filled with Daniel's attempts to rationalize what he's seeing. He considers hallucination, mentioning that he's well rested and hasn't taken any medication that might cause visions. He checks his carbon monoxide detector, which is reading normal. He splashes water on his face, slaps his cheeks, and announces that he's definitely awake. He grabs his binoculars and looks again, and his voice cracks slightly as he says, "It's still there. It's real. Or I'm really seeing it, which means I don't know what that means." You can hear the fear creeping into his voice now, the fear of a rational man confronting something that violates every principle of reality he's built his life upon. Then Daniel does something that would become a critical point in the investigation. He describes feeling what he calls a pull, not physical but mental, a compulsion to look at the structure, to focus on it. He says it's beautiful in a way that makes his chest hurt, that the geometric patterns are mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. His voice takes on a dreamy quality as he describes the colors shifting through the pattern, hues he says he's never seen before, that don't have names. He talks about feeling like the structure is waiting for him, that there's something at the top of it, something important, something he needs to see. And then he says something that would echo through every discussion of his disappearance. "I know this sounds crazy, but I think I'm supposed to go there. I think that's why it appeared, for me." The recording captures Daniel moving around the boat, and from the sounds, investigators believe he was preparing to launch his dinghy. You can hear ropes being moved, metal clips rattling, and Daniel grunting with effort as he apparently tries to get his inflatable tender ready for deployment. But then there's a pause, and Daniel's voice comes back, sounding almost surprised at himself. "What am I doing?" he says. "This is insane. There's nothing out there. I need to call someone. I need to call the Coast Guard and tell them." Tell them what? That I'm seeing things, that I want to row toward a hallucination. For a brief moment, it seems like Daniel's rationality is reasserting itself. He talks about turning the boat around, heading back to Santa Barbara, getting checked out by a doctor. He mentions carbon monoxide poisoning again, or maybe a stroke, something medical that could explain visual hallucinations. But even as he's talking about these possibilities, his voice sounds hollow, like he doesn't believe his own words. And then, abruptly, he falls silent. The recording continues, but for nearly 3 full minutes, there's no sound except the ambient noise of the boat and the ocean. When Daniel speaks again, his voice has changed completely. It's calm now, preternaturally calm, like a man who's made a decision and is at peace with it. "I see it clearly now," he says. "It was never about the structure. The structure is just a representation, a way for my mind to interpret what's really there. What's really there is a threshold, a boundary between states, between thinking and not thinking, between the noise and the silence. I've spent my whole life listening to the noise, the constant chatter in my head, the planning and worrying and analyzing. But out here, in the middle of all this empty water, the silence is so close. It's been right here the whole time, just waiting for me to notice it. And now I have, and I can't unsee it." The next words on the recording are the ones that would be quoted in every article, every documentary, every podcast episode about Daniel's disappearance. His voice is quiet but perfectly clear, and there's an edge to it that investigators described as both serene and terrifying. He says, "The sea isn't empty. It's full of the most perfect nothing you can imagine. And I've been so tired of being something. I think I'd like to try being nothing for a while, just to see what it's like, just to see if it's quieter there." There's movement on the recording after that, footsteps that sound like Daniel walking forward on the deck. There's a soft splash, but it's not the sound of a body hitting water. Investigators who listened to it repeatedly said it sounded more like something small being dropped overboard, perhaps his wallet or some other personal item. Then Daniel's voice one more time, barely above a whisper. It's so much closer than I thought. Just one step, and then the recording goes silent except for the ambient sounds. No splash, no cry, no struggle, just the gentle lapping of water and the creak of rigging. The boat sails on alone for another 3 hours and 40 minutes before the fishing vessel spots it. The investigation into Daniel Ashford's disappearance became one of the most intensive maritime searches in Southern California Coast Guard history. They covered over 2,000 square miles of ocean, using boats, helicopters, and fixed-wing aircraft. They deployed drift models based on currents and wind patterns. They issued urgent broadcasts to all vessels in the area. They found nothing. No body, no debris, no life jacket, nothing that suggested where Daniel had gone. The water temperature was mild, around 67 degrees Fahrenheit, which meant that if he'd fallen overboard, he could have survived for many hours before hypothermia became a factor, but there was no sign that he'd ever entered the water at all. His safety harness and tether were still stowed, suggesting he hadn't been wearing them. His life jacket was undisturbed. If he'd gone overboard accidentally, it would have been the first time in his 32-year sailing career that he'd violated his own safety protocols in calm conditions. The voice recorder became the centerpiece of the investigation, and it sparked intense debate among the experts called in to analyze it. A forensic audio specialist confirmed that the voice was definitely Daniel's, and that the recording showed no signs of tampering or editing. The metadata from the device confirmed it had been recording continuously from 5:13 a.m. to 9:58 a.m. on July 12th. The ambient sounds on the recording matched the weather conditions reported by nearby vessels and weather stations. Calm winds, light seas, clear skies. There was no audio evidence of any emergency, no sounds of equipment failure, no indication of foul play or intrusion by another person or vessel. A psychiatrist who specialized in maritime mental health listened to the recording and provided an analysis that would fundamentally change how investigators understood the case. She pointed out that Daniel's descriptions of geometric patterns, structures emerging from the water, and shifting colors were consistent with a specific type of hallucination associated with acute psychotic episodes. But more significantly, she noted that his later comments about silence, nothing, and being tired of being something were textbook examples of what's called passive suicidal ideation, a mental state where someone doesn't necessarily plan their death, but becomes increasingly receptive to the idea of not existing anymore. The doctor's conclusion was carefully worded but devastating. Daniel Ashford had likely been experiencing a sudden onset psychotic break, possibly triggered by an undiagnosed mental health condition or physiological crisis, and in that altered state, he had likely gone overboard intentionally. This psychiatric interpretation was supported by a detail that investigators discovered when they examined Daniel's laptop more closely. His browser history showed that in the weeks before his departure, he'd been researching topics related to depression, isolation, and what he'd called the burden of consciousness. He'd visited forums where people discussed existential dread and the appeal of non-existence. He'd watched videos about meditation practices focused on ego death and the dissolution of self. None of this had been shared with his friends or family. To everyone who knew him, Daniel had seemed fine, perhaps a bit quieter than usual, but nothing that raised serious concern. But the digital trail suggested a man who'd been wrestling with dark thoughts in private, thoughts he'd been careful to keep hidden behind his competent, methodical exterior. The medical examiner's office requested Daniel's health records, and what they found added another layer to the tragedy. 6 months before his disappearance, Daniel had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease. The diagnosis had come after he'd noticed a slight tremor in his right hand and some stiffness in his movements. His neurologist had assured him that the condition was manageable with medication and that many people live full, active lives for decades after diagnosis. But the records also showed that Daniel had refused to start the recommended medication. When his doctor asked why, Daniel had simply said he needed time to think about what this means for his future. There was no indication that he'd shared this diagnosis with anyone. His friends didn't know. His family didn't know. He'd kept this information completely to himself, carrying the weight of it alone through 6 months of what must have been agonizing introspection about his identity, his capabilities, and his future as a sailor. The investigation's final report, released 4 months after Daniel's disappearance, concluded that he had died by suicide while experiencing an acute dissociative episode, likely precipitated by underlying depression related to his recent medical diagnosis and exacerbated by the isolation inherent in solo sailing. The report noted that the conditions he was sailing in, far from being safe, may have actually contributed to his mental state. The profound calm, the empty horizon, the absence of any external stimulation or distraction, these things can create what psychologists call a sensory deprivation state, where the mind, lacking external input, begins to generate its own experiences. Combined with his emotional distress and possible medication withdrawal or neurological changes from his unmedicated Parkinson's disease, Daniel's brain had essentially created a hallucination that gave form to his underlying desire to escape from his situation. The structure he described, the threshold he talked about, these were projections of his own mind, offering him a narrative that made sense of an impulse that otherwise would have been inexplicable to a man who'd spent his life being rational and careful. The most haunting aspect of the report was its conclusion about Daniel's final words. The investigators noted that his statement about wanting to try being nothing for a while wasn't a metaphor or poetic language. It was a literal description of his mental state. He'd reached a point where the simple act of existing, of being a conscious entity with thoughts and feelings and a body that was starting to fail him, had become unbearable. And in that moment, alone on a calm sea with nothing to distract him from his own thoughts, he'd found a way to frame his own death as a choice, as an experiment, as something other than the desperate act it truly was. The maritime community struggled to process Daniel's story. How could a man with 32 years of experience, a man known for his caution and competence, simply disappear in perfect conditions? The answer, as difficult as it was to accept, was that the most dangerous conditions aren't always the ones with the biggest waves or the strongest winds. Sometimes the most dangerous condition is the one inside a sailor's own mind. Mental health crises at sea are vastly underreported and poorly understood. The sailing community, like many outdoor adventure communities, tends to attract people who are self-reliant, stoic, and reluctant to show weakness or vulnerability. These very traits, while useful for handling the physical challenges of sailing, can become lethal when someone is struggling with depression, anxiety, or other mental health issues. The stigma around mental health in maritime circles means that sailors often suffer in silence, convinced that admitting to psychological struggles would be seen as evidence that they're not tough enough for the sea. Daniel's case prompted several sailing organizations to develop new safety protocols focused specifically on mental health. They began advocating for pre-departure mental health check-ins, similar to the equipment checks that sailors routinely perform. They developed guidelines for recognizing signs of psychological distress in fellow sailors and protocols for responding when someone seems to be struggling. They emphasized that checking on a crew member's or fellow sailor's emotional state isn't weakness or intrusion, it's seamanship. Because the sea is indifferent to whether you drown from a flooded cabin or from a flooded mind, the outcome is the same. One of Daniel's closest friends, a sailor named Marcus Chen, who'd crossed the Pacific with Daniel 15 years earlier, gave an interview 6 months after the disappearance. He talked about the guilt he felt for not noticing that Daniel was struggling, for not asking the right questions, or pushing past Daniel's habitual stoicism to find out what was really going on beneath the surface. Marcus described receiving the news of Daniel's disappearance and immediately thinking there must have been equipment failure or a freak accident, because that's what made sense. The idea that Daniel had been carrying such profound pain that he'd reached a point where oblivion seemed preferable to existence was incomprehensible to those who knew him as the competent, unflappable sailor he appeared to be. But Marcus also said something that resonated with many people who heard Daniel's story. He said, "We spend so much time preparing our boats for the worst conditions, making sure every system has a backup, every piece of gear is reliable. But we don't prepare ourselves the same way. We don't build backup systems for our minds. We don't acknowledge that sometimes the rigging that fails isn't made of steel, it's made of neurons and neurotransmitters. And when that fails, no amount of safety equipment will save you." Daniel Ashford's body was never recovered. He was declared legally dead after the standard waiting period, and his family held a memorial service on a beach in Santa Barbara where he'd launched countless sailing adventures. The Meridian's Call was eventually sold at auction, purchased by a couple who planned to restore her and continue sailing her. They reported no unusual experiences aboard, no sense of haunting or tragedy. The boat, after all, was just a boat. It had no awareness of what had transpired on its deck that calm July morning. It continued to be what it had always been, a well-built vessel suitable for ocean passages, neutral and indifferent to human drama. The story of Daniel Ashford isn't a story about the sea being dangerous. The sea that morning was as benign as it ever gets, a mirror-calm surface under perfect skies. It's a story about how the most experienced among us can still be vulnerable in ways that no amount of preparation or equipment can protect against. It's a reminder that we are not just sailors or adventurers or competent technical operators. We are human beings with complex inner lives, with fears and sadnesses and struggles that we often hide from others and sometimes even from ourselves. And when we take ourselves out onto the ocean, we take all of that with us. The isolation that makes sailing feel like freedom can also amplify whatever darkness we're carrying inside. If there's a lesson in Daniel's final baffling words, it's this: the most important safety equipment you can bring aboard isn't a life raft or an EPIRB or a backup radio. It's the courage to acknowledge when you're not okay, the willingness to reach out for help before the silence becomes overwhelming, and the recognition that staying alive sometimes means admitting you need support. It means building a community of sailors who check on each other, not just about their weather routing and fuel state, but about how they're actually doing, mentally and emotionally. It means creating a culture where talking about depression or anxiety or existential fear isn't seen as weakness, but as the kind of honest seamanship that keeps people alive. Daniel's voice recorder sits in a Coast Guard evidence locker, a small digital device containing the final words of a man who vanished into mystery. Those who've heard the full recording say the most unsettling thing about it isn't the bizarre descriptions of structures and patterns, isn't even the calm acceptance in his final words. It's the normalcy of the beginning, the cheerful sailor noting the beautiful dawn and looking forward to meeting a friend for dinner. That ordinariness, followed by such a profound unraveling, is what makes the story so disturbing, because it suggests that any of us, on any day, under any conditions, might be closer to that edge than we realize. The sea didn't take Daniel Ashford, but something did, something that had been pursuing him long before he cast off from Santa Barbara, something that finally caught up with him when he was alone with nothing but calm water and his own thoughts. The final image from that morning, reported by the crew of the fishing vessel that first spotted the Meridian's Call, was of a perfectly beautiful boat drifting on a perfectly calm sea under a perfectly clear sky. Everything looked exactly as it should, except for the one thing that mattered most. The human being who should have been aboard was simply gone, vanished as completely as if he'd never existed at all, leaving behind only a recording that posed more questions than it answered. And in the end, perhaps that's the most fitting legacy for a man who spent his last moments describing a threshold between something and nothing, between the noise of existence and the silence beyond. Daniel Ashford crossed that threshold on a morning when the sea was so calm you could see your reflection in it, and he did it in a way that ensured we'd never stop asking why.